in the last unit, we talked about what the theory of regenerative social design and regenerative organizational design is like. But how do we apply that theory to actually designing an organization? What does that even entail? Well, as it turns out, the regenerative design process that works so well for healing landscapes and making net zero buildings also applies to organizations like businesses and nonprofits. Briefly, that regenerative design process looks like setting goals, observing the context around you, assessing what does that context mean, coming up with a big picture of how you're going to intervene in that landscape, diving down into the details of those interventions, implementing those interventions, and then throughout the whole time, looking for feedback about how that went and integrating what you're learning into the process. Another really useful tool that's been developed more in the startup community over the last 15 years or so is something called the Business Model Canvas. I talked about this in my book, Change Here Now. Well, in this course, in the Organizational Design Intensive, we're going to be combining that regenerative design process with some of the areas and questions of the Business Model Canvas in a framework that we're calling the Regenerative Social Design Canvas. So this canvas is a series of 12 different modes or steps. They are certainly presented in a logical order, although inevitably they're not always done in that order. And each one of those steps represents a different way of thinking about your organization from a holistic perspective. The first 6 or so steps of that canvas you could think of as inhalation. We're taking things in, we're learning, we're absorbing. And then the second half of the canvas is about exhalation. It's about getting creative and coming up with ideas about what we're going to offer to the social landscape that we've been learning about all along. Because we're going to be bouncing back and forth between these steps again and again, we're creating this rhythm of inhalation and exhalation and really embodying that idea of our organization as something that is breathing, something that is alive. Another philosophy of the Regenerative Social Design Canvas is that it follows the permaculture principle of design from patterns to details. So some of the first steps in the canvas are really about looking at the big picture, setting the overall vision of what it is we're trying to accomplish, looking at the overall landscape of who are the different people and organizations that are active in the space that you're trying to work in. And then from there, moving into more and more detail. How are you going to engage with them? What lessons are you learning along the way? What messages do you want to share? How are you generating revenue? How is your decision-making model structured? And so on into finer and finer levels of detail. So as we mentioned in the first video, the Regenerative Social Design Canvas is going to provide the framework for the rest of this organizational design intensive. Each step of this canvas is a different session, and within that session, you'll find anywhere between 2 and 6 units. And in each of those units, we're going to explore that mode or that step of the canvas with a different framework, a different set of questions. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to be giving a broad overview of the canvas so you know what to expect for each session. And then from there, you can bounce around and go to the sessions that you think are most relevant for your current place in your design journey. The first step of the canvas is what we call set an intention. This is going to be where, as the name implies, you're coming up with the overall intentions for this design process and for your organization as a whole. We're inviting you to make a vision statement, to create a purpose statement, to come up with your core values, and along the way identify what is your capacity and goals for this process. The next stage is survey the landscape. That means taking a look at who are the different players in this landscape. Who are the people you're designing for? Who might your allies be? Who are your competitors? Who are what we call parasites or predators? What energies and trends and forces are shaping that landscape of social design? And just as importantly, What does your internal team look like? Whether that's just you as a solo designer or a whole group of folks, and how are you all working together? The next step we call explore the landscape. Once you have a sense of who all is out there, you need to decide what it is you want to learn from them. How are you going to engage with them? What kind of questions do you want to ask? What people or organizations seem like they might be the highest priority for you to earn the trust of and what we call build relational soil with? From there, we move on to the step that's called name where it hurts. By this point in the process, you should be starting to get a pretty good idea of what's going on in your social landscape. And so this is where we move from observation of what are the individual data points to assessment. What do those data points mean? Specifically, we want to ask the question of what is the source of dysfunction in the social landscape? What are the root causes of what's not working? And so we're going to identify that through a number of different analysis exercises. So once we've identified what's not working, then we're going to flip that on its head and move to what we call describing wholeness. The core aspect of describing wholeness is coming up with an irresistible scenario of reintegration, figuring out what in the social landscape would it feel like and look like and sound like for wholeness to be present. Then, in Discover Your Offering, you're going to take that scenario of reintegration and apply that directly to your organization. What is the specific, unique, irreplaceable role that you and your organization can play to create that sense of wholeness? After that, we're moving to the step called Define Success. This is where you're going to get really practical and methodical about how you're going to measure if you're getting towards success as an organization. We're going to walk through definitions of, we're going to think through our qualitative indicators and quantitative indicators, how to measure each one, and how to track them all in one place as a dashboard that you can use as an active decision-making tool to help you guide your organization towards its goals. After defining success, we're going to tell the story. This is all about messaging, trying to get the word out to the people who you most feel need to hear what you're up to. We're going to think through what are the core messages that your stakeholders should hear about your efforts, and what channels, or in other words, what forms of medium or communication will you use to reach those stakeholders. In mapping resource flows, we're going to look at the inputs of time, talent, and money that your organization requires to thrive. We're going to look at different revenue models so that your organization can make the money that it needs to make sustainably. And we're going to do what's called a capital analysis to look at the many forms of wealth that might be present in your organization. In structure internal systems, we're going to be looking at that internal workings of your organization. How do decisions get made? How does power work? How is conflict addressed among the members of your organization and between your organization and others? And finally, what is the appropriate legal structure? Should you incorporate as a 501c3, an LLC, a cooperative, or something else? As we start to come full circle, it's now time to test our hypothesis. What elements of all of these design ideas can you test out right away? And how can you set up that prototype for success? And finally, we've come to the last step of reflection and integration. In this step, we're going to ask ourselves, what have we learned from our most recent design efforts? What is your edge of growth at the moment? And what assumptions have you been making that might need to be revisited or challenged? So, that's what the Regenerative Social Design Canvas looks like. That is essentially the table of contents for the rest of this intensive. So before we move forward, take a look at the worksheet below and set your priorities for which parts of the canvas you're more interested in exploring. Now that you've finished this video, all of the rest of the units and sessions are going to be unlocked, so feel free to start exploring them in whatever order and pace feels right for you. Good luck.